The National Child Traumatic Stress Network is a federally funded collaborative initiative of leading research and clinical institutions integrated with community-level treatment centers. The network's mission is to raise the standard of care and improve access to services for traumatized children, their families, and communities throughout the United States. To learn more, please visit our website at www.nctsnet.org.
The insights, findings, real-life examples, and expert commentary that follow are meant to be considered and used along with this video's companion print curriculum, which offers more detailed and case-specific information. Practitioners are strongly encouraged to seek out additional consultation, training, and supervision in order to develop your expertise related to childhood traumatic grief and its treatment. All children and adults actively participating in the production of this video have completed an informed consent process and have volunteered freely to participate in this project. Children depicted in this production are either actors or survivors of childhood traumatic grief who have completed and are no longer in active treatment. We thank them for their participation and contributions to this video. The following video presentation is intended for a variety of professionals who work with children or adolescents. Whether you work in the medical profession as a nurse, psychiatrist, or general practitioner, or in the mental health field as a therapist, social worker, psychologist, or pastoral or bereavement counselor, this program offers vital information about recognizing and treating children who suffer from childhood traumatic grief. What is childhood traumatic grief? Childhood traumatic grief is a condition that children may develop after a loved one dies under circumstances that they perceive as traumatic.
Childhood traumatic grief is a condition in which children who lose loved ones under very unexpected, frightening, terrifying, traumatic circumstances develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress and other trauma symptoms which interfere with their ability to progress through typical grief tasks because they're stuck on the traumatic aspects of the death. This prevents them from being able to grieve the loss of their loved one and can affect them in profound ways that can last the rest of their lives. When these children recall the traumatic nature of how their loved one died, they experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress. They have intrusive, terrifying thoughts over and over again that they can't get out of their minds about the traumatic event that led to the death. And this leads them to be unable to reminisce. In some cases, they become avoidant of their family, their friends, their usual activities because they associate all of those with the loved one who's died.
So children lose the developmental momentum that they had been pursuing. They need support to regain that developmental momentum, and without the support, it often happens that children really stop gaining the skills that are appropriate for their age, and that has long-term repercussions.
The typical traumatic stress symptoms that children might experience with childhood traumatic grief include things like intrusive thoughts or recurring images associated with the death of their loved one. It could be the child becoming very constricted emotionally, becoming numb as a way of not dealing with all the pain associated with the tragic circumstances of their loved one's death. A child who has childhood traumatic grief doesn't have to have all those symptoms, just some of them.
In non-traumatic bereavement, kids may be sad or upset or feel lonely, but they're able to continue on with activities and eventually maybe enjoy life again and be re-engaged with people and situations. The child with traumatic grief is kind of stuck, so a child may not want to be around a cousin who's the same age as her sister who died because it's too upsetting. Or a boy may not want to play baseball anymore because he can't bear the thought of looking over in the stands and his father not being there, and he falls apart. So these things segue into the awful reminders, and the child then avoids every reminder, even a positive one.
Childhood traumatic grief and post-traumatic stress disorder overlap. There are a set of symptoms that children, or adults for that matter, would need to have in order to have post-traumatic stress disorder. For childhood traumatic grief, you just need to have some post-traumatic stress symptoms. And that's really the central theme for childhood traumatic grief, the post-traumatic stress symptoms interfering with the normal bereavement process.
The symptoms of childhood traumatic grief can widely vary. In some cases, when children experiencing traumatic grief reactions do not receive appropriate help or treatment, they can develop more serious problems that can impact their development as they grow into adolescents and young adults.
This can range from suicidal gestures to behaviors like using drugs, promiscuous sex, dropping out of school, becoming aggressive with others, losing trust that they are going to do well in life or that they're going to be loved, and the child can really move from a healthy developmental trajectory to a self-defeating trajectory with long-term consequences into adulthood.
Another common reaction to childhood traumatic grief is revenge fantasies. For example, when a child wishes to punish a perpetrator. 5 days after her mother was fatally shot and stabbed by her estranged boyfriend, Lisa, an 11-year-old girl, revealed this dream in an interview with her therapist.
In my dream, I had the same knife he used to stab my mother and the same gun that he shot her with. Then I went up to him and said, "Do you remember this? Now you could feel it." And I stabbed him right where he stabbed my mother. Then I said, "I guess you remember this too," and then I shot him.
Who suffers from childhood traumatic grief? Most children appear to recover even after losing a loved one to traumatic circumstances. However, if we just consider the impact of urban violence alone, up to 70% of children in inner-city communities have seen someone shot or stabbed, which means that even if only 5% of these children develop childhood traumatic grief, this translates into thousands of children developing this condition each year. This does not begin to account for the thousands more children who suffer traumatic losses due to other causes. Traumatic grief is a serious and widespread problem that can affect many of our children each and every year.
Most children who experience the traumatic death of a loved one do not develop childhood traumatic grief. We're only now beginning to understand what kind of variables influence whether a child will or will not develop child traumatic grief.
Although it is not always possible to predict who will develop childhood traumatic grief, there are a number of conditions that put children at greater risk for developing problems following a traumatic death. Practitioners should be alert for children who have experienced previous traumas, prior mental health problems, poor parent or family functioning, a lack of social support, and secondary adversities. These are problems that directly result from the death, such as changes in financial circumstances or displacement to a new and unfamiliar place of residence. There are a variety of events related to the actual death that can also be troubling, traumatic, or life-threatening. These would include experiences immediately prior to or following the death, such as being present during a terrifying physical fight, seeing someone subjected to invasive medical procedures, or witnessing attempts to recover a body from a fire.
Should the child attend the funeral? When should the child go back to school? What should the child be told about the death? All these are questions that the family is grappling with, often without guidance. And it's important for the therapist to raise these questions and to participate as a partner in coming up with decisions that will be supportive of the child.
How is childhood traumatic grief treated? Due to the complex interaction of trauma symptoms and reactions to usual bereavement, researchers and practitioners have found it necessary to treat both the trauma and grief.
The younger the child, the more dependent the child is on the parents for feeling safe and protected. And nobody knows the child better than the parent. Nobody can provide the feeling of safety and protection that the parent can provide. And for that reason, parents need to always be involved in the treatment of childhood traumatic grief.
Sometimes when we talk to parents, they're resistant to the idea of children recounting the details of the trauma. In fact, quite honestly, sometimes therapists are resistant to having children recount the details of the trauma. The primary reason for that is that parents and therapists alike don't want children to be exposed to more pain and more difficulty. Parents often feel my child's been through enough, and if we put them through more, it's just going to be too much. Kids might experience some pain associated with detailing what happened to their loved one, but if they experience a little anxiety and pain associated with doing that now, that's going to save the child from a deeper, more disturbing problem later on because it wasn't addressed when it could have been.
It's very important to understand the specific religious beliefs and culture and customs that families use in dealing with bereavement, because these may be very important when you hear about the stories of what happened before or after the death, because you want to make sure that your own specific beliefs or ideas are not imposed on the child and the family.
This video describes and demonstrates how treatment would be done with an individual school-aged child. When a parent has died, it is especially important to involve the surviving primary caregivers in treatment whenever possible. Many of the same principles and techniques can be adapted and used in a variety of clinical and school settings, and with both younger children and adolescents. For example, clinicians and researchers have used trauma and grief-focused interventions with groups of Bosnian youth following the war in their country, and with children who developed childhood traumatic grief in response to urban violence in Los Angeles. Others have applied similar strategies to their work with young toddlers and their surviving parents. The principles of treatment presented in this video can have wide-ranging applications. In the curriculum guide, you will find resources and suggestions for adapting the methods described here for use in other situations.
Professionals have been working with children who have experienced the trauma for many years, and they've also been working with kids who have experienced the death of someone important. What's different about this particular treatment is in some ways it takes the best of both of those kinds of treatments and experiences and applies it in a very comprehensive way to kids with this very special and particular problem.
What are the key components of childhood traumatic grief treatment? The following treatment components represent a promising approach that professionals from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network have found to be effective in helping children overcome their trauma and grief-related symptoms and reactions. The main components of the treatment for childhood traumatic grief are psychoeducation, affect expression, developing stress management skills, cognitive affect regulation, the creation of a trauma narrative, cognitive processing, and finally, moving through the grief-related bereavement tasks. The child first learns ways to cope with the frightening thoughts, images, feelings, and arousal associated with the traumatic experience of the death. Once the traumatic aspects recede, the therapist is better able to help the child integrate what was learned with a less trauma-focused worldview. The therapist is then able to help the child actively engage in remembering the person who died.
In doing the treatment, we often start with educating the child about the kind of treatment and the reasons it's important to focus on the trauma. So the first job is to really help them feel more in control of those upsetting reactions. And you do that by teaching them ways to manage their stress.
Educating the child and a parent about the common reactions to trauma and their cause provides useful language and background for understanding what they're experiencing. It can also be a relief to have a way to describe confusing and distressing reactions.
Additionally, we help children tolerate reminders, not only trauma reminders, but change and loss reminders, by giving them some strategies for planning that.
By focusing first on helping children develop their own coping strategies for dealing with their stress, they become less scared about confronting the very sad and upsetting and terrifying things about the death itself.
Helping children with affect expression is an important beginning step in the treatment. The goal is to have children identify a variety of feelings, pleasant ones as well as those that make them uncomfortable or that they perceive to be bad.
One of the first things you want to do is help them just talk about their feelings, recognize them, be sensitive to them, and understand what they are and where they come from.
There are a number of therapeutic games and creative activities that can be used to help children with this component of treatment. Children can add expression to an outline of a face, decorate two sides of a mask to show outside feelings visible to others, and more private inside feelings, or pick songs that portray different emotions.
In helping children label and identify their feelings, you also want to help them understand that there's lots of different kinds, not just sad ones or upsetting ones. You also want to make sure they understand what kinds of situations may be associated with certain kinds of feelings, so that they're put in a context for a child.
Stress management skills are used to help children and parents manage unpleasant physiological trauma reactions and symptoms, feel more in control, and cope effectively with traumatic reminders. Some of these skills include relaxation techniques such as focused breathing and progressive muscle relaxation. Young children are often able to relax their bodies by pretending to be a wet noodle or a Raggedy Ann doll. Other stress management strategies include thought-stopping techniques, such as envisioning a stop sign or learning how to change an imaginary TV channel to replace a traumatic thought with a more pleasant one. Older children may prefer other strategies, such as listening to their favorite music. These skills are generally taught to both the parent and the child in the clinician's office, and the child is encouraged to practice them at home. Therapists should encourage children and parents to develop individualized stress management strategies that work best for them.
It's really important for therapists who are implementing the traumatic grief model of treatment to be flexible in their approach. Children of the same age are still going to be very different in their personalities, going to be very different in their level of symptomatology, going to be very different in how comfortable they are in the treatment process. So therapists is going to need to be very flexible and treat each child individually.
To help children better regulate their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, they are also taught about the cognitive triangle. Children learn how thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are different, and how they interact in day-to-day life. Specifically, children come to understand that the way we think about events in our lives colors how we feel about those events and how we react to them behaviorally. Affect regulation involves helping the child learn ways to use appropriate thoughts and behaviors to control and manage troubling feelings. The therapist works with the child to help him or her recognize how certain situations are related to negative thoughts and behaviors. For example, if feeling rejected, a child is taught ways to modify his or her behaviors by learning positive ways to make friends. Collectively, these techniques help children manage the uncomfortable thoughts and feelings related to the death. It is necessary to establish these skills in preparation for the next important treatment component, creating the trauma narrative. What is a trauma narrative? A trauma narrative is the recreation or retracing of the child's death experience as told in their own words, pictures, and even songs. By creating the story, the child is carefully exposed to the traumatic elements of the death and gradually becomes able to tolerate the more painful and disturbing aspects of the experience.
Many clinicians who've received training and are using the model often will indicate to us that they believe the trauma narrative is the core of our treatment approach.
A child with childhood traumatic grief typically avoids reminders and aspects of the death because they cause overwhelming and upsetting thoughts and feelings. By confronting such feelings in a safe and controlled environment, while also using the stress-reducing strategies and coping skills previously learned, the child becomes desensitized to the trauma and better able to tolerate thoughts and feelings about the death.
The trauma narrative is typically developed gradually over several sessions. We will often start by having the child describe something about themselves. This helps children feel more comfortable in telling their story or writing their book. Then we have the child focus on what life was like before the traumatic event that took their loved one away from them. As the child comes closer to talking about the traumatic loss, through talking about less threatening aspects, they're more able to engage in the process of gradually talking about more and more upsetting aspects of the traumatic death itself.
Another goal of the trauma narrative is to help put the trauma in some kind of context in their life. That as horrible and as tragic as it was, we're trying to contextualize it in some way. Many kids, as they go forward after the traumatic loss, as painful as it was, they also see themselves as stronger.
There are a variety of ways a child can create a trauma narrative. In addition to writing, some children may prefer to document their story in other ways, such as by writing a play, composing a song, or making a video. Once completed by the child, ideally the trauma narrative is then shared with the parent, again according to carefully guided steps in order to help the parent and child effectively communicate about the upsetting circumstances of the death.
What was helpful to Hannah in treatment was the story that she got to tell about her grandmother's death. Because until then, I don't think she was able to express what she envisioned her grandmother's death was all about. She heard us discuss it. We discussed it with her in our terms. But I don't think she understood exactly. She wasn't able to express exactly what she thought. And the story gave her an opportunity to understand what Grandmommy might have been looking like while she was dying in bed. Hannah had a vision in her head as to what this all looked like that nobody else shared. So for her to be able to draw this and talk to somebody about it was very, very helpful. I think it gave her more permission to remember her without feeling so much pain, because she had, one of her pictures was a great picture where she, at the end of the story, where she's smiling on the ground, she's on the ground, and she sees Grandmommy up in the clouds with a big smile, an angel smiling down at her. I think she felt safer.
As the trauma narrative is being created, the therapist is able to identify thoughts and beliefs about the traumatic event that are inaccurate or not helpful. Once the narrative is completed, the final trauma-related phase of treatment is used to modify and correct these thoughts and beliefs.
For example, a child who blames him or herself for the death of their parent or sibling would be expected to have much greater emotional distress than a child who knew that it was not their fault, who knew that there was nothing they could have done to prevent that.
Unhelpful beliefs may be totally false. Others may be accurate, but unhelpful. After a child's specific trauma-related cognitions and beliefs have been identified, the therapist and the child begin to evaluate and correct them. This can be accomplished through the use of such techniques as progressive logical questioning, best friend role plays, and therapist-child role reversal. These techniques are further described in the accompanying curriculum. Following the trauma-specific treatment, the therapist then works with the child to help master the grief-focused bereavement tasks. How are grief-related issues handled in the treatment process? Many of the techniques used in bereavement therapy and supportive counseling are similar to what would be done in this phase of the treatment.
The goal of the grief focus work is to help a child have memories about the person that they can access in a positive way, also to help them understand what kinds of other relationships they may have in their life, how they're different, how they're the same, also prepare for the rest of their life without that person, times that may be difficult, and what to do about that.
In encouraging children to move to the bereavement-focused components of treatment, it's critical that the child be able to look at and face what they've lost.
The main components of the grief-related phase of treatment are communicating about the death, mourning the loss, dealing with ambivalent feelings, preserving positive memories, redefining the relationship, recommitting to new relationships, and making meaning of the death. When the trauma symptoms recede, the child is better able to communicate about death. The goal here is to have the child become comfortable talking about death and to ask questions in order to develop a clear understanding of death. This can be accomplished any number of ways, such as playing a specific grief board game or reading age-appropriate storybooks with the child and discussing the information.
You want a child to realize they may have learned something important about themselves, or about life, or about other things that are important to them because of the person that died and the way they died.
Mourning the loss encourages and supports the child in acknowledging what has been lost by the person's death. The process may begin with an activity such as an anagram where the child focuses on characteristics of the person. As the child becomes more comfortable talking about the person, he is encouraged to list or describe things he will miss and not be able to share with the person in the future.
And it's important for the child, in order to accept the magnitude of the loss, to be able to name these things that they've lost.
Rather than avoid the topic of the person's death, the child is then better able to talk about the person and anticipate situations and pain that can be aroused. Another bereavement task involves acknowledging and accepting any ambivalent feelings about the deceased. If the relationship was highly ambivalent prior to the death, the feelings of grief can be more difficult to express.
There might have been some aspects of the relationship that weren't always that positive. For example, you might have a child who loved her dad who died in tragic circumstances, but perhaps the dad never spent any time with her.
In particular, the child may feel guilty about having negative feelings such as shame or anger toward the deceased, and may think it means she didn't really love the person.
When I was 14, my father passed away from a pulmonary embolism. And that was traumatic for me because it was so sudden and unexpected. We had some harsh words before he died, and I said that I hated him and that I hoped that he would die. I felt so guilty about what I had said and thought that I had something to do with his death.
Therefore, the therapist helps the child to understand that it is normal to have both positive and negative feelings toward the deceased by encouraging expression of all feelings about the person. One technique that may be useful in this process is having the child write a letter to the deceased in which she describes a range of feelings, and then write a second letter that the deceased would write back if he could. Different exercises are used to help children preserve positive feelings and memories of the deceased person. This task is often a necessary prerequisite for helping children to give themselves permission to commit to new relationships. Some positive memory activities include making a scrapbook or a memory box of the deceased person. Children are encouraged to ask other family members to assist them with these activities in an effort to facilitate open communication regarding the loss. Other techniques may include recreating a memorial service or another ritual, particularly if the child was unable to attend the actual funeral.
In order to successfully grieve the loss of a loved one, it's important for a child to convert the relationship from one of interaction to a relationship that is based on memory, not current interaction.
This bereavement task is designed to help children accept that the relationship with the deceased has changed from one of interaction to one of memory. One technique that is often used to exemplify this change is a drawing of two balloons, one that is anchored to the ground and the other that is floating toward the sky. The child identifies things that she has lost in the relationship, such as going to baseball games together, and writes them in the floating balloon. The child also identifies things that remain in the relationship with the deceased, such as memories of fun times, and writes them in the balloon on the ground. This helps children to understand that although some aspects of the relationship have changed, their positive memories can serve as the foundation for a new and different relationship with the person who died. Following the death of a loved one, children may be reluctant to engage in new relationships out of loyalty to the deceased. They may also feel that no other person will ever be able to make up for the loss of that loved one. Once children feel less reluctant to engage in new relationships, they may need some assistance in developing them. For example, it may be important to help the child identify people who could fill roles previously held by the deceased. Following the death of a young child's parent, a new kind of relationship may need to be established with the existing caregiver, or in some instances, it may be crucial to form a bond with a new parent figure. Making meaning of the death is a bereavement task that encourages children to view their traumatic experience as one that, while difficult and painful, has helped them to have grown or become stronger in some way.
You want to help a child develop some meaning about the death. It's not to turn it into a positive experience, but you want them to realize they may have learned things about themselves, about other people, or may learn that there's a way to help other kids that are in the same situation.
Becoming a mentor, a volunteer, or joining a group like Students Against Drunk Driving are 3 examples of children making meaning out of their loss by participating in new activities and interests. Activities like these often help children find meaning in the face of tragedy and can teach them that they are stronger than they think.
One of the most important things we can do for children and parents in preparing them for the termination of treatment and for coping with future trauma, change, and loss reminders is to review with them the 3 Ps. The 3 Ps include predicting that they will experience difficulties in the future when trauma, loss, or change reminders occur. Planning for how to optimally cope with those reminders when they occur, and giving permission to themselves and to other people in the family to have difficulties in the future.
Termination is especially important for these kids and can be useful in helping them realize that relationships can come and go throughout the rest of their life, and that's not the same as a relationship ending because someone died.
What should you learn and take away from this presentation? As a medical or mental health care professional who treats or comes in contact with children or adolescents, it is critical that you understand the 3 R's of treating childhood traumatic grief: recognize, respond, and remember.
For clinicians who are unfamiliar with childhood traumatic grief, it would be important to help them recognize that childhood traumatic grief includes both traumatic stress symptoms and that these traumatic stress symptoms interfere with the child's ability to go through the normal steps of the bereavement process.
Things to look for include children who do not talk about their lost loved one, who avoid reminders such as going to the gravesite, who do not want to remember or memorialize the person who died, children who are very avoidant of talking about not only the death and the cause of death, but also the loved one.
As practitioners, I think it's very important that we respond to childhood traumatic grief because it's something that children do not outgrow. And if we don't respond, it's quite likely that they're going to continue to have the traumatic stress symptoms, and these children won't be able to go through the normal grieving process.
We need to know that children always remember. The question is how they remember. For this reason, it's very important to help the child translate visceral memories of fear and anger into cognitive memories so that the child can be helped to develop coping mechanisms for feelings that are overwhelming in order to help them become modulated and under control.
One of the best things you can do for these children is help them realize it's okay to remember the way the person died as well as who that person was.